Chapter 13. The Story of Prince Sincere. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Old Fairy Tales by Laura Valentine. The Story of Prince Sincere. There was once upon a time in the country of Zinzolantines a king who had an extreme passion for silkworms. He spent whole days in his gardens gathering mulberry leaves for their nourishment. The remainder of his time he spent in his closet, watching those little animals at work and making skeins of the silk they had spun, for he could find no one to do this to his satisfaction. In fact, no one could perform this office so well as his Majesty. He frequently made presents of his skeins to the lords of his court, most of them, of course, silkworm fanciers, as they, like all true courtiers, gloried in imitating their sovereign. Now, what was the consequence of all this? Politeness and wit abandoned an abode where they were so slightly esteemed. Rudeness and folly seized upon the youth of the court, and weariness or ennui fell to the lot of its fairest ladies. Hopeless of having their charms and accomplishments appreciated by men who only understood and admired the beauty of silkworms and the fineness of their silk, nearly all the ladies retired into the distant provinces of the kingdom. In one of these there was formed a little court, not of princes, not of dukes, nor even of marquises, from neglect and rudeness, but of persons of a less elevated grade, who, possessing none of the above titles, were not the less worthy men on that account. At this little court were to be found refined tastes and virtuous principles. Its inhabitants cultivated the sciences, and enjoyed all reasonable pleasures without ever banishing that delicacy which constitutes their principal charm. In a word, they were in all things the exact reverse of those who composed the court of his silk-winding Majesty, from which the Queen was one of the first who retired. She had a very fine castle, situated in a forest near the seashore. This castle she chose for her residence, and having bade the king adieu, to whom her departure caused no great uneasiness, she set out, accompanied by the two princesses who were the sole fruits of her marriage with the king, and a few of her attendants, of whose zeal and affection she was assured. The solitude of the castle did not disgust her. She embellished it by tasteful improvements, and made it a charming abode by uniting within and about it some of the most beautiful objects of nature, and the most perfect productions of art. Surrounded by persons whom she loved, she enjoyed in this retirement a tranquil repose to which she had before been a stranger. The princesses also were delighted with their abode. They were fond of music, and among their train were several who cultivated that art with the most brilliant success. These two young ladies were equally beautiful in face as in figure, yet were they not equally amiable. The elder, whose name was Catherine, was proud, envious, revengeful, and cruel. The younger was gentle and affectionate, and her greatest pleasure was to oblige. In her heart and in her mind she had 1,000 charming qualities, which made her beloved by all who had the happiness to know her. She consequently deserved the characteristic name of Amy. She was affectionately attached to her sister, though she was not ignorant that she was disliked by her. One day, after enduring a torrent of reproaches from Catherine because she would not appear in an unsuitable dress at a masked ball at which a numerous assemblage was expected, Amy took a solitary walk by the seashore to dissipate the sorrow that her sister's ill humor had engendered. Catherine, filled with anger at her sister's non-compliance with her wishes, went also to walk in a neighboring forest, that she might devise a dress to appear in at the ball which should eclipse in brilliancy that of Amy. Filled with these thoughts, she had walked some distance from the castle without perceiving that she had gone much farther than she had intended. Weariness at length obliged her to seat herself at the foot of an old oak tree, whose foliage formed a shade impenetrable to the rays of the sun. Accidentally examining the immense size and thickness of the trunk of this oak, Catherine discovered a little key concealed between the bark and the wood. She took it in her hand, unable to divine what could be its use, and why it was there, and then endeavored to replace it. After trying to do so 2 or 3 times unsuccessfully, she pushed the key into a hole that she observed, when immediately the key turned round of itself. A little door flew open, which was sunk in the tree with infinite art, and the door being opened discovered a staircase. Catherine, curious to know where it could lead, determined to descend. The first steps were very obscure, but as she descended she noticed with surprise that the staircase was lighted by numerous waxen tapers placed in rock crystal lustres. The princess continued to descend, and having gone down more than 300 steps, she came to a magnificently furnished apartment. It will be said that it is astonishing and almost impossible that a young person of her sex should be sufficiently adventurous thus to enter alone into an unknown cavern. But I must inform my readers of a fact of which I possess undoubted evidence, which will cause their wonder to cease. Namely, that Catherine wore on her little finger a ring that had been bequeathed to her by her grandfather on his deathbed, which would preserve her, until her 20th year, from every species of danger. Persuaded, therefore, that she had nothing to fear, she walked onward until she came to a large cabinet, or rather a storeroom, of rare jewels and precious stones. Catherine paused to examine the rarities she saw around her, when her eye, chancing to alight on a bed of cloth of silver standing in a kind of recess or grotto, what was her astonishment to observe, posing thereon, the handsomest young man she had ever beheld. He seemed to be buried in a profound sleep. Catherine approached to consider the sleeper more attentively. This curiosity cost her dearly, for from that moment she was no longer mistress of herself. Convinced, as all pretty women are, that no one could see her without loving her, she did not hesitate to awaken the charming unknown, with the hope of inspiring him with that tenderness which she already felt for him. Accordingly, she made a slight noise in passing into the next apartment, so that he might not think she had awakened him designedly. On entering this room, she found a written paper containing the following words: "She only, who shall be able to inspire the ugliest of mortals with the passion of love, can make an impression on the heart of the prince who reposes here." The Princess Catherine perused this paper several times, and flattered herself that her charms were quite powerful enough to affect the sleeper without her being obliged to seek out the ugliest of men in order to inspire him with a hopeless passion. Filled with this self-confidence, she was about to re-enter the cabinet, not doubting that she should find the unknown awake, when a spider's web, through which it was impossible to see any object distinctly, opposed her ingress directly she approached the door. "So slight an obstacle shall not prevent my entrance," said Catherine, and she endeavored to pass. But, notwithstanding all her efforts, she could not succeed in lifting or breaking through the web. Astonished to find such strength in so apparently slight a fabric, she resolved to reascend into the forest, to return to the queen, and have a search made for this ugliest of all ugly men, whom it was necessary to inspire with love ere she could hope to be beloved by the charming person she had just seen. Accordingly, she retraced her steps through all the apartments, ascended the staircase, passed out by the door in the tree, which was remaining open as she had left it. And no sooner was she in the open air than the door closed of itself so effectually that she could not observe exactly where it was, nor could she find the little key again. She walked several times round the oak with this view, but she could not succeed. Desperate at this last circumstance, she turned toward the castle, and as she was walking on the seashore, observed the Princess Amy, her sister, attentively examining a diamond of surprising size and beauty. A bird had just let it fall on her dress, telling her to keep it very carefully, as it would one day preserve her in a moment of great danger. Catherine, enchanted with the beauty of this admirable jewel, wished to have it in her possession, but attempting to snatch it from Amy, she was prevented by a little man from behind her, whose frightful appearance made both the princesses take flight and run for shelter into the forest. The little man was 3 feet high. His very large and flat head was thatched with lank red hair. His eyes were sunk in his head, and of such small dimensions that they would have been indistinguishable but for the bright red with which they were bordered. His nose was red and pointed. His cheeks hung as low as his breast, and his mouth and chin were graced by a long and bushy red beard. His ill-shapen body was supported by a single leg, on which it was balanced as on a pivot. But so nice was its equilibrium that the slightest breath of wind made it turn round continually, for which reason he went out in very calm weather only. He did not walk at all, but hopped with wonderful agility, and by many little hops he soon arrived wherever he wished to go. Catherine, recovered from the fear that the little monster had occasioned her, soon returned to him, and in an ill-humoured tone asked who he was, and what could have made him daring enough to oppose her desires. "I am a powerful king," answered the deformed, "and my name is Sincere. Reasons which I cannot disclose to you have banished me for a time from my dominions, and have obliged me to pass my time in the hollow of a rock, situated not very far from hence. I have seen you several times in this charming neighborhood. I have frequently noticed your unkind proceedings toward the princess, your sister, and I have only just prevented another injury you would have committed in taking from her a diamond, which is her property. My natural love of justice, joined to an impulse that I dare not declare, induced me to take your sister's part, and to prevent your doing her that wrong." Catherine heard the prince's long answer to her question with extreme impatience. However, she dissembled her anger, on reflecting that the speaker could not possibly be equaled for ugliness, and that consequently she ought to neglect nothing to please him, since it was written that on that condition only could she inspire a passion for herself in the person whom she now so dearly loved. Accordingly, assuming a more gentle air, she told Sincere that the rank of king and the unfortunate condition to which he appeared to be reduced compelled her to pardon him, that she even desired the honor of his friendship, which she flattered herself he would not refuse. She then invited him to the castle, assuring him that the queen, when she should learn of his quality, would doubtless offer him apartments in which he might tranquilly reside until fortune should cease to persecute him. The king politely thanked her, and told her that he was too well aware of his excessive ugliness to dare to flatter himself with the hope of obtaining the friendship of so beautiful a princess, or of residing at a court where he knew that the deformity of his figure could never be forgiven. Having expressed himself to this effect, the king made Catherine a bow and hopped away, sighing, and looking toward the amiable Amy, whom the presence of her sister had kept at a short distance during this conference. Amy had, however, overheard her sister's conversation with Sincere, and had been as much surprised at the affected kindness of the Princess Catherine as at her having invited him to the castle. She therefore reluctantly concluded that the princess had only assumed a show of mildness as a cloak to some wicked design. The pity that Amy felt for all who were unfortunate made her resolve immediately to warn the king that he should not place too much confidence in her sister's apparent friendship, and it was with some impatience she perceived that her engagements would compel her to defer until the morrow the execution of her project. But the next day, accompanied by a female attendant, Amy left the castle and took the road leading to Sincere's rock, at which she had nearly arrived when she heard someone singing a song, the words of which appeared to be addressed to herself. She stopped to listen. The tone of the voice she heard was so melodious, and so pleased her ear, that she remained riveted in the spot for some time after the song had ceased, until Cecily, her attendant, dispelled her reverie by informing her that Sincere was coming toward them. Although Amy had made up her mind to regard him without fear, she nevertheless found that she could not look upon him without trembling, and immediately turned away her face. Sincere appeared to observe her emotion with sorrow, but, saluting her very respectfully, he invited her to walk into his rustic palace to repose herself. Amy accepted his courtesy, telling his Majesty at the same time that she had come purposely to his grotto, that she might inform him of something of great importance. The king offered her his hand as gracefully as he could, and led her toward his grotto, entertaining her with the most lively conversation. The princess could never have imagined a person so ugly as Prince Sincere, with a mind so lively and penetrating. Everything he said, too, was pronounced in a tone that so charmed the princess that she could not help wishing over and over again that if ever she had a lover he might be possessed of the intelligence and graceful spirit of this unfortunate. At last she came to the rock which contained Sincere's grotto. It was carpeted with soft green moss. Within it was a table formed by a slab of white marble, of which nature had been the only artificer, while a bed and a few turf seats were the only furniture that Sincere's residence contained. A cascade of fresh and pure water fell from the height of the rock, and formed a small streamlet, whose gentle murmur, with the melodious songs of the nightingales perched among the branches of an orange tree laden with blossoms and fruit, sounded more charmingly in the princess's ears than the finest concert she had ever heard. After praising his pleasant retreat, Amy unfolded to Sincere her reasons for paying him this visit. The prince, charmed at the interest she took in what concerned himself, was very eloquent in the expressions of his gratitude. Some words even escaped him which made it sufficiently apparent that his heart was filled with the most tender love. Amy remarked them, but feigned not to understand that they were addressed to herself, and, by way of changing the subject of conversation, she informed the king with what satisfaction she had overheard a charming voice shortly before she saw him, and asked him if he were acquainted with the person who sang so well. "It is a prince who adores you," answered Sincere, "and who would make you an offer of his heart, his hand, and the crown that he will one day wear, but that his form forbids him to hope." Sincere sighed as he said these words. The princess blushed, and, not doubting that it was of himself he spoke, questioned him no further, and became very thoughtful. Shortly afterward she quitted the grotto, fearful that her absence might be noticed. She walked in the direction of the palace, observing to Cicely that she thought Sincere was a very intelligent man. "I protest, my dear Cicely," said she, "I feel for him, notwithstanding his deformity, what I never felt for any one before." "What, madam?" said the astonished attendant. "Is it possible that you can regard the little monster with any other feeling than horror? Nay, that you should even feel anything like affection for such a creature? Surely you could never resolve to live with him. What could you do with so hideous a being? The smallest wind makes him turn round like a weathercock." "Ah," said the young Princess Amy, "but then he thinks with such vivacity, and speaks with so much eloquence, that I should prefer him to the handsomest man in the world. Handsome men are nearly always wretchedly stupid, and too much in love with themselves. They pay greater devotion to their looking-glasses than to our sex." The princess would have continued, but at that moment she heard a cry that stopped her, and looking on the ground she saw with much surprise a white viper darting fire from its eyes, which spoke to her as follows: "Madame, you were about to crush me beneath your feet. If I were not so forgiving as I am, I should punish you for your thoughtlessness, but I pardon you on condition that you place me on the trunk of the large chestnut tree near you, from the branches of which I have just fallen. One of these days I shall acknowledge the service, for I am a fairy, though in common with all my sisters I am obliged to quit my natural shape one day in every week, and assume that form which may be ordained by an old sorcerer from whom we derive our power, and who punishes us in this way for having, one day while he slept, cut off his beard and mustachios, which were extremely displeasing objects. This evening I shall resume my usual form, and you will hear from me." Amy took the viper tremblingly in her hand, when it had ceased to speak, placed it on the tree, and hastily left the spot, unwilling to look again on an animal that had caused her so much fear. She then made the best of her way to the castle, where, on arriving, she learned that Katherine had just dispatched a courier with a message from the queen inviting King Sincere to come and spend a few days at the palace. This at first alarmed Amy, who was acquainted with her sister's wickedness, but her uneasiness was soon dissipated, for one of Catherine's attendants, to whom that princess had confided her adventure, informed her of what had taken place in the forest. Sincere was, as you may suppose, surprised at the queen's invitation. His first impulse was courteously to refuse it, but on reflecting that, by accepting it, he would be enabled to see the beautiful princess with whom he was in love every day, he resolved to set out, and hopped into a little calash that had been sent for his accommodation. His arrival was awaited at the castle with great impatience, arising, however, from widely different motives, the ladies of the court being curious to see a man who was unlike all other men, Catherine anxious to make a conquest of him for the sake of gaining the sleeper, and Amy looking for his arrival in the hope of enabling the wretched man to pass at least some days agreeably. At last he arrived, and was received with all the honors due to his rank. Catherine, who welcomed him very benignantly, was magnificently dressed, and looked so well that but for her sister she might have been pronounced the most beautiful woman in the universe. She was therefore much mortified to observe that, in spite of all her blandishments, Sincere was insensible to her charms, and that his regards were constantly directed toward Amy. Her anger was boundless to think that, having done all in her power to please the ugliest man in the world, she was yet unable to succeed. Whatever offends the self-love of the ladies is never forgiven. Accordingly, she became infuriated against the prince and her sister. What would she not have given to have prevented their seeing each other? However, that was impossible, for the king, being at liberty to speak to Amy, availed himself of every opportunity of so doing. While it was obvious that Amy was no unwilling auditor, and could not deny herself the pleasure of listening to Sincere. As the Princess Amy was one evening walking in an avenue in the park, she observed a ball rolling toward her very quickly. It stopped directly it was within a yard or two of her, and opening of itself, there issued from it a little woman, who continued to increase in size until she was 10 or 12 feet high. "I am the fairy Severe," said she, addressing Amy, "whom you were kind enough to assist a few days ago." Amy recognized her, for the fairy darted fire from her eyes as did the white viper she had placed upon the tree, and accordingly she saluted her very respectfully. Severe proceeded to inform Amy that the friendship she felt for that princess had induced her to demand her hand in marriage of the queen for the king of the butterflies, her nephew, who was the most amiable man in the world. "I have just left the queen's closet," concluded the fairy, "and I have obtained your mother's consent. His majesty will arrive here in 2 or 3 days to make you his queen." This information, which would have afforded much pleasure to many princesses, sensibly afflicted the young Amy. She was so much grieved at hearing it that she was unable to utter a word in answer to the fairy. Severe, imagining that joy prevented her speaking, kissed her forehead. Then, bidding her adieu, she re-entered her ball, which returned in the direction it had come. At this moment Cicely brought the princess word that the queen wished to speak with her. Accordingly she hastened to her mother, who, without giving her time to speak, ordered her to prepare herself to receive the king of the butterflies as her husband at the end of 2 days. Amy threw herself at her mother's feet, and conjured her to recall the promise she had made to Severe. The queen, however, was inflexible. She dreaded the power of the fairies, and hopeful that Severe would one day confer on her some mark of her friendship, she told her daughter that she would be obeyed. Amy dared not reply, and retired in deep affliction. Catherine, who at any other time would have been jealous of the fairy's preference for her sister, was delighted at the intended match, flattering herself that when Sincere no longer saw Amy, he must fall in love with herself. This sorrowful news was not long in reaching the ears of that unfortunate king, and it affected him to such a degree that he fell dangerously ill. Meanwhile, the day arrived on which the fairy's nephew was to be presented. The queen, the princesses, and all the court went out to receive him, and had no sooner reached the terrace than they perceived afar off a very brilliant-looking kind of cloud, which was rapidly approaching the castle. It immediately struck them that this must be the prince, and the conjecture proved to be well founded. The king of the butterflies was coming, seated in a diamond chariot, drawn by upward of 10,000 butterflies, all of a delicate rose color. They were harnessed to the chariot by traces of fine gold thread, interwoven with consummate skill. 100 young lords followed their master in calashes of rock crystal, set with emeralds and rubies, drawn likewise by butterflies, but the latter were quite white. When the king's chariot arrived near the place where the ladies were standing, his majesty alighted in their presence, his suite attending him in admirable order. He was richly dressed, and never was dandy more powdered or better curled than his majesty. He must have passed at least 3 hours at his toilet, and his dread of disarranging his curls made him walk very gently. However, this did not prevent his appearing to great advantage, and everybody admired him, the ladies making observations to each other as to the delicate whiteness of his complexion and hands. Nothing could exceed the symmetry of his shape, with which, indeed, he himself seemed to be not a little enamored. He easily recognized the Princess Amy by a portrait which had been given to him by the fairy, and having approached that young lady, he made her a very formal bow, and presenting his arm, said to her, "This is not a proper place, charming Amy, to compliment you on your beauty. The air is too sultry. Is it possible to converse at one's ease on a terrace, exposed to the melting rays of the sun? Therefore, let us enter the palace, and not risk our being turned black as Ethiopians." And almost without saluting the queen and the ladies of her suite, the king of the butterflies turned toward the castle. Having entered, with the Princess Amy and those who accompanied her, into a large saloon which had been prepared for his reception, he threw himself on a sofa, observing that he was stifled with heat, and then he lolled at full length in a position anything but graceful. However, he was polite enough to ask the princess's pardon for his apparent disrespect, assuring her that he was in absolute want of repose, and that he must be a little cooler before he could resolve to speak to her on the important subject of his coming. Thereupon he drew sundry diamond-smelling and essence bottles from his pocket, and poured some perfume on his hands. Then, pulling out 2 or 3 jeweled gold boxes, he took snuff, and commenced humming a little air, which having concluded, he asked Amy whether she did not think his equipage was very splendid, and whether his dress, which he had selected from among 200, was to her taste, finishing by relating to her the history of the numberless ladies who were dying of love for him. It is easy to judge whether such topics were gratifying to the fair Amy, she who preferred wit and good sense to every charm of person, and who was quite different from the generality of her sex, on whom a magnificent suit of clothes, a dashing figure, and a few other equally worthless attractions make more impression than an amiable heart and an enlightened understanding. Accordingly, she conceived so great an aversion for the king of the butterflies that she was obliged to quit the saloon, stating that she was unwell, and retire to her apartment, there to conceal her sorrow and her tears. Although Sincere was unwell, on hearing of Amy's illness he contrived to drag himself to her apartment to inquire after her health. When the Princess Amy saw him, she sighed and said, "Ah, Prince, why has not the queen destined me to be yours? Are you unable to snatch me from him to whom they would by force unite me?" Sincere, enraptured, seized her hand, and kissing it tenderly, said, "What, beautiful Amy, is it possible that you would rather live with me than with a prince whose handsome face, person, and manners are universally admired? Deformed as I am, can I be so fortunate as not to be hateful to your sight? In mercy, answer me. Your reply will decide on the happiness or misery of my life." "Yes, sir," said the charming Amy, "know that I love you. This confession—" She would have spoken further, but Sincere, hopping backward, became gradually smaller and smaller, until at last he was quite invisible. A heavy cloud of smoke then appeared, where he had lately stood, which slowly clearing away, the princess discovered an extremely handsome young man, whose looks, at once majestic, benignant, and intelligent, inspired her with a certain indescribable emotion, which engaged her heart in his favor the moment their eyes met. The Princess Amy continued for some time to regard him with equal admiration and surprise, but her astonishment increased tenfold when the stranger addressed to her, in the most respectful manner, the following words: "The charming avowal you have just made, madam, has forever ended my enchantment. I am the Prince Sincere, who, under my former wretched form, was rash enough to tell you he adored you." Amy recognized him by the tone of his voice, and giving vent to her joy at finding him so different from what he had hitherto appeared, she entreated Sincere to inform her how such a strange metamorphosis had been brought about. "I am the sovereign," answered the prince, "of the island of Sincerity, and when the event I am about to relate to you happened, I was reigning over that island very peaceably, beloved by all my subjects. One day, at the chase, as I was very eagerly pursuing a lion which had escaped me several times, I unconsciously lost my way. I found myself in a shady walk, when, on looking around me, I observed a woman shaped exactly, madam, as you have always hitherto seen me. I gazed on her in astonishment, and I could not forbear laughing to see her turn round on her single leg like a weathercock. She perceived my mirth, and in an angry voice asked what amused me. Politeness forbade my telling her, but she pressed me so closely that I at last confessed that her singular figure had provoked my laughter. My candor displeased her. She knit her brows, and after throwing 2 or 3 somersaults in the air, said, "As a punishment for your insolence, I ordain that your form shall become similar to mine, and no power shall restore your proper shape until you meet with a young princess, in whom are united wit, good nature, and beauty, for whom you shall feel a violent love, and who, notwithstanding your deformity, shall be inspired with sufficient passion for yourself to make you, unasked, an avowal of her tenderness. You will, however, resume your natural form during the space of 1 hour every day, but it shall only take place in a certain cavern situated in a forest in the dominions of the silkworm fancying king. I ordain further that you shall not be permitted to apprise any person whatever of your misfortune until your enchantment shall be dispelled." I listened very patiently to this threatening speech, believing that it would not be followed by any effects. But what was my grief when, after this frightful fairy, for fairy she was, had breathed on me, I became as misshapen as herself. My transformation completed, she hopped away laughing with all her might. I dared not return to my palace and state what had occurred, persuaded that I should neither be recognized nor believed. The desire I felt to recover my original form prompted me to travel through many kingdoms and visit many courts, in hopes of finding such a princess as the fairy had mentioned, but my travels were attended by no result. I consequently grew tired of searching, and formed the resolution of leading a solitary life in some retired nook, far removed from the habitations of my fellow men. I made choice of the rock where you visited me, and I had resided there about a year when I had the happiness of seeing you for the first time. You appeared to me a divinity. I felt that you were the only person who could inspire me with love, though I dared not hope to inspire you with that passion in return. Nor could I even think it possible that you could endure to look upon me. I went occasionally to the cavern in the forest to enjoy the satisfaction of seeing myself for a few minutes in my natural form, as you now see me. One day I was surprised at being visited there by the princess your sister, for a talisman opposed the entrance of all mortals into the cavern. I feigned to be asleep that I might avoid speaking to her, and because I felt that the moment of my restoration to my horrible shape was drawing near, and it took place the moment your sister went into the next apartment. I quitted the cavern by an avenue unknown to all save myself. Catherine, however, left it also in the same manner, for it was impossible for her to re-enter the apartment in which she had seen me. She completed her 20th year while she was in the cavern, and her ring had virtue against talismans until she had attained that age only. There, dearest Amy, is the history of my metamorphosis. It now only remains for me to declare my lasting passion for you, and to entreat you to allow me to solicit your hand of the Queen, your mother, and her Majesty's permission for you to reign over my dominions, where you will find everybody zealous to obtain your favor." As Sincere ceased to speak, Catherine and Severe, who had overheard the whole of his discourse with Amy, entered the room. Both of them were in transports of rage. The fairy because Amy preferred another to her nephew, and Catherine because Sincere, in whom she recognized the charming young man she had seen in the cavern, was in love with her sister. She gave vent to her incensed feelings against the two lovers in a torrent of abusive language, but Severe terminated the dispute by seizing the unfortunate Amy by her flowing ringlets and dragging her through the open window, while the king, in despair, was unable to offer the slightest opposition. The miserable Sincere immediately rushed out of the palace, in spite of Catherine, who would have detained him, and without knowing whither he went, he hastened onward, resolved to take no repose until he should have recovered his dear princess. The King of the Butterflies, on being informed of what had transpired, laughed heartily. He thought it a very good joke, and returned to his kingdom. Meanwhile his good aunt dragged Amy along at immense speed, and after scaling many steep rocks and traversing many wide deserts, arrived at the base of an old tower. The door opened at her bidding, and she entered, pulling the princess after her. Severe made Amy follow her into a large hall full of snails, and told her in a shrill voice that if she would not consent to marry the King of the Butterflies, she must in the space of 8 days teach all these snails to dance or become herself a snail. Having made this threat, Severe flew away, and the princess gave way to a violent burst of tears, without feeling the slightest inclination to obey her. Let us leave her to weep over her seemingly hopeless task for the present, and return to King Sincere. That prince, having passed through several kingdoms, came at last to a thick forest. On walking a short distance into this forest, he perceived a house built entirely of leaves, the door of which standing open, he saw an old woman seated in an armchair, reading aloud to 3 little children. He passed the house without stopping, or taking any notice of it, and was proceeding on his way, when the old woman called after him, crying in a cracked voice, and shaking her head, "Prince, you are searching in vain. You will never meet with the Princess Amy until you shall have first found a brilliant frog, an extremely ugly woman, who is conscious of her want of beauty, and does not attempt to make conquests, and a witless man who does not flatter himself that he is clever." King Sincere rightly judged from these words that the speaker was a fairy, so he entreated her to grant him some other and less difficult means of recovering his charming Amy. But she only answered him by grimaces, and burst into a loud fit of laughter. The disconsolate prince was consequently obliged to proceed onward, though he was extremely fatigued, and very much afflicted, and quite unconscious as to the road he was taking. He met another old woman, who asked him what occasioned his grief. Sincere informed her of his misfortunes, not omitting what the fairy he had just left had said to him, and adding that he could not flatter himself with the hope of ever seeing his beloved Amy again, if it were indeed true that happiness depended on his finding a brilliant frog. "This," said he, "appears to me to be utterly ridiculous even to seek. The 2 other conditions would cause me less uneasiness." "Do not flatter yourself," said the good woman. "They are, at least, equally difficult to accomplish. However, by diligent searching you may meet with all 3 of the required curiosities. But if at the expiration of a year from this time you shall not have discovered them, take my advice,
and trouble yourself no further, for your case will be hopeless. Go, I may not tell you more, but do not let my sister, whom you have just quitted, see you again in this vicinity. She is wicked, and you might experience some treachery at her hands. She has only informed you of the conditions on which you are permitted to withdraw your princess from her place of confinement, because she is persuaded that you can never fulfill them."
The king, who had some reason to dread enchantments, hastened away as fast as he could, and traveled through every kingdom in the world on a horse which he most fortunately found on quitting the wood. In every city, town, village, hamlet, and castle that he came to, he made an indefatigable search for the ugly old women and stupid men. He found abundance of both, but remarked that none of the ladies were offended with their truth-telling mirrors at the reflection of their ugliness, nay, that they all conceived it to be quite easy to render themselves still attractive by a slight and judicious use of the most renowned cosmetics. Some whom he saw painted an inch thick at least. Others were sundry patches very artfully disposed, and all decorated themselves with flowers and ribbons enough to stock a milliner's magazine, and flattered themselves that, in spite of time, they were still very amiable, and that they might dispute the palm of beauty with the fairest and the youngest. This common effect of self-love on the sex did not surprise the prince. He knew that all ladies are endowed from their birth with a tolerably good opinion of themselves, but what did indeed astonish him was that he found among the men the same self-love equally strong, and with such an addition of little weaknesses as would even make the fair sex itself contemptible. He had always heard that man was the most perfect of nature's work, and he, being a man, had given faith to the aphorism without examining it too closely. But his opinion on this subject was strangely altered by the opportunities which his travels afforded him to study this creature of perfection more attentively. He now observed that the minds of most men were occupied by trifles, that many spent their time wholly at the toilet, at table, at play, or what is worse, in professing passion where they felt none; that others assembled in society, not to reason with sense and propriety, but to repeat all the nonsense they had heard elsewhere, to exchange bon mots current in every jest book, and to make a display of the valuable rings, jewels, and all the finery which their ill-spent incomes placed within their reach. He met with some more senseless still, who, fancying themselves extremely clever, were continually arguing without understanding what they talked about, or perceiving that they made all who were patient enough to listen to them yawn with fatigue. With others, who were sanguine enough to hope that they were making themselves agreeable by repeating bad stories that they had already thrust upon their auditors upward of 100 times, while others again, who, not letting a word fall from their lips because they actually knew not what to say, imagined that their silence would be esteemed as a mark of wisdom. I should never conclude were I to mention all the different kinds of fools Sincere met with in his travels. Yet could he not among them all find one such as he sought, for there was not one of them who did not think he had wit. In search of the man, the woman, and the frog, he had twice traveled round the world, but each time unsuccessfully, when, beginning to lose all hope of ever finding them, he remembered what the good old woman had told him, and thought that he ought now to renounce life, since life no longer had charms for him. While absorbed in these reflections, he found himself on the banks of a river. The sight of the water offered too favorable an opportunity for self-destruction to pass unnoticed. Accordingly, he plunged into the stream, resolved at once to put a period to an existence that his misfortunes had rendered insupportable. Instead of drowning, however, as he wished and expected, he felt himself gently sinking beneath the waters, and almost immediately alighted on a flowery turf in the middle of a fine garden. At first Sincere thought he must be dreaming, but on assuring himself that he was not asleep, he arose and looked around him. in order to discover the inhabitants of these subaqueous regions. The prince walked about for some time in this solitary place. At last he heard the sound of horns and dogs, and in a moment afterward the huntsman burst upon his sight. Never was surprise equal to Sincere's. The huntsmen were so many immense frogs, mounted on large green cats, and they were in chase of a hare. Some of them were dressed in the costumes of Amazons, others wore taffeta gowns and little caps on their heads decked with flowers and feathers. Several of them were sounding horns, while others were hallooing to the dogs. In a word, the sight was at once beautiful and unique. They desisted from hunting on seeing Sincere, and alighted from their cats to meet him, walking upright on their 2 hind legs, and using their 2 others as we use our arms. When the troop arrived near the prince, she who appeared to be the mistress of the rest very gracefully saluted him. She wore a long purple gown embroidered with pearls and diamonds, and bore on her forehead so brilliant a mark that the eyes of Sincere could not bear to look on it. "You are welcome, sir," said she, "and your arrival has long been expected. We are all enchanted, and you alone can dissolve the charm. I have not been always in the condition you see me. I formerly reigned over this kingdom, and the frogs you see around me were my subjects. I had so violent an aversion to animals of the frog kind that I gave orders for all found in my kingdom to be put to death. Nothing was neglected that could contribute to the extirpation of these objects of my dislike. But notwithstanding, as I was taking a walk one evening, I discovered one almost under my chamber window. I immediately called my attendants and gave orders for it to be killed, but the frog had disappeared, and had so effectually concealed itself that after the most diligent search it could not be found. I was walking the next day near the same spot, when a very ugly black woman appeared before me. In one hand she held a hazel wand, and in the other a vial full of oil, which having poured on my head, she said, "I am the fairy Grenouilletta, and the person whom you yesterday so kindly desired to be put to death. Indeed, your orders have exposed me to death 100 times, but the hour of my vengeance is arrived. Become a frog in your turn, you and all your subjects who have so blindly obeyed you. I ordain that you shall remain under that shape, until a king who shall stand in need of your assistance shall in return restore you to your proper form." Hardly had the fairy pronounced these words, when I was transformed into the creature you see. I applied immediately to a fairy who protected me, but she was not permitted to disenchant me. She described to me, however, the person who alone had power to do so, and told me that he had a white hair in his left eyebrow, bestowed on him by a skillful magician at the moment of his birth, and which enabled him to dispel all enchantments. This fairy has conducted you hither, and it was she who, under the form of a bird, made the Princess Amy a present of the superb diamond. And lastly, she it was who took care to place this brilliant mark on my forehead, and who will enable you to find a witless man who is aware of his stupidity, and a woman who is conscious that her ugliness is insupportable. These 2 extraordinary persons she has brought hither, fearful that the self-love which reigns in the world should corrupt them, as it has corrupted every one else, and thus destroy your hopes. You will find them in a little cabin at a short distance from this spot. But, Prince, before you visit them, pray have the kindness to restore to us our natural shapes, and allow us to pull from your eyebrow the famous hair to whose virtue we shall owe our restoration, as it will be equally necessary to enable you to effect the deliverance of your princess." Sincere wanted no more entreating, but suffered the hair to be pulled from his eyebrow. He took it from the frog, and touching her and all those around her therewith, they were immediately changed into princes and princesses, very good-looking and very amiable. The queen and her subjects were sufficiently eloquent in their thanks to King Sincere for his kindness. At the moment the transformation took place, the second old woman that the prince had seen in the wood appeared, and told Sincere that, as a recompense for the service he had just done her friend, she would, after he had visited the foolish man and the ugly woman who would give him an herb that he would presently have occasion for, transport him to the place where his beautiful Amy was confined. Accordingly, Sincere paid a hasty visit to this singular pair, found them to be such as he was in search of, and received from them the mysterious herb. The kind fairy then took an apple, which she changed into a very pretty carriage. It traveled without horses at the rate of 300 miles a minute, and is supposed to have been the first swift carriage invented. She seated herself therein, and placed the prince by her side. Sincere was charmed with this wonderful vehicle, but never will carriage be made to travel fast enough for a lover impatient to rejoin his mistress. Nevertheless, they arrived in an incredibly short space of time at the base of the tower in which the beautiful Amy was confined, weeping over tasks impossible to perform, and which the fairy Severe had assigned her, to afford herself a pretext for tormenting the lovely princess. We left Amy in her prison, weeping over the apparently hopeless task of teaching a quantity of snails to dance, and we are now going to inform those who feel any curiosity to learn how the princess performed that difficult exploit. From the first 7 days she wept unceasingly, and gave herself no trouble about the instruction of the scholars that had been placed under her charge. But on the 8th day, which was that on which the fairy was expected to return for the purpose of changing her into a snail, should she not have succeeded, her grief was redoubled to think of the time she had thrown away. However, she determined immediately to give the awkward animals some lessons, but soon saw that all her instructions were useless. Persuaded that her fate was inevitable, she thought seriously of putting an end to her existence, for she preferred death to becoming a snail or marrying the king of the butterflies. With these thoughts in her mind, the miserable Amy threw open the window with the intention of precipitating herself from it. But, fortunately, recalling to her recollection at that moment the ring she had received from a bird, and the words that accompanied the gift, she drew it from her pocket, and regarding it attentively, "Beautiful, brilliant," said she, "if you have the power to rescue me from the danger I am in, I entreat you to put a period to my misfortunes." Directly the Princess Amy had pronounced these words, the ring opened, and there issued from it a string of little dancing masters and violin players. The latter immediately commenced playing, while the dancing masters arranged the snails in sets, and taught them in an instant every kind of dance. Then all the musicians and the masters disappeared. This marvelous occurrence greatly comforted the princess. She wiped away her tears, kissed her ring in a transport of joyful gratitude, and concealed it more carefully than she had previously done, fearful that Severe should learn its value and take it from her. Hardly had the princess placed her ring securely in her bosom, when the wicked fairy arrived, and asked her, with a malignant smile, if her scholars were proficient in the art of dancing. "You shall see, madam," said Amy, in a mild and timid voice. Then, opening the door of the hall that contained them, the princess began to sing. On hearing her voice, all the little animals began to dance, and that so prettily, especially the waltz, gallopade, and saraband, that Severe became at once surprised and furious. The poor princess having succeeded so well in this, the merciless fairy gave her other and still more difficult tasks, but Amy performed them all with the assistance of her ring. Her repeated successes so enraged the fairy against her that she shut Amy in a large iron cage, placed her in a yard full of wild and ravenous beasts, and stationed 2 terrible dragons to guard the door, who made frightful efforts to break open the cage and devour the princess. The unfortunate princess had been thus confined about a month when she saw Sincere enter the yard. He had easily obtained admission by touching the door with his herb. Amy shuddered at the danger to which her lover was exposed. Directly Sincere saw his mistress in that cruel situation, he put his hand on his sword with the intention of slaying the 2 dragons. I say put his hand, because ere he had time to draw it, the good fairy who had conducted him thither desired him to hold, and to touch them only with the herb which he held in his left hand. Sincere did so, when the dragons immediately fell dead at his feet, and touching the door of the cage with the charmed hair of his eyebrow, he instantaneously felt himself, the princess, and the kind fairy ascend into the air surrounded by a fleecy cloud, which speedily conveyed the trio to the island of Sincerity. The king was immediately recognized by his subjects, who testified such joy at their sovereign's return as showed how severely they must have felt his loss, and how dear he was to them. For his part, in ecstasy at finding himself again with his beloved, he said to her the most passionate things, to which Amy replied with a tenderness quite equal to his own. Sincere instantly dispatched ambassadors to the court of the silkworm fancying king, to demand the princess in marriage. The ambassadors were not long in executing their commission. On their return they brought intelligence that his silkworm fancying majesty had blown his brains out with a pistol, about 12 months before, in consequence of being unable to wind an exceedingly entangled skein of silk; that the queen had died 6 months afterward of the smallpox, and that Catherine had poisoned herself on the day of Sincere's departure in search of his mistress. The Princess Amy was very much afflicted on hearing this sorrowful news, and immediately went into mourning for her parents and sister, which she wore for 6 months. At the expiration of that time she married King Sincere, and they lived together for a long series of years without experiencing the slightest misfortune, or ceasing to love each other as tenderly as on the day of their wedding. The beneficent fairy then set out from their court to rejoin Queen Brilliant, her friend, and the hair of the king's eyebrow, which had been to them of such assistance, was set in a golden ring, which Sincere wore ever afterward on the third finger of his left hand, to preserve him from the malice of fairies. End of chapter 13.
Chapter 14 of Princess Rosetta. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kristin Lewis, Houston, Texas. The Old Fairy Tales by Laura Valentine. Princess Rosetta. There was once upon a time a king and queen who had 2 fine boys. As they grew to boyhood, they became beautiful as the day. So well were they nurtured that they looked older than they were. The queen never failed to invite the fairies at the birth of her children, and she always begged her visitors to tell her what would happen to them. After a while she had a beautiful little girl, who was so pretty that it was impossible to see her without loving her. Again she invited the fairies, and they came in great state, the chief fairy in a sledge drawn by reindeer, for her home was in the far north. The queen, having regaled all the fairies who came to see her on the occasion, said to them, as they were about to leave, "Do not forget your usual custom, but tell me what will happen to Rosetta," which was the little princess's name. The fairies told her that they had left their conjuring book at home, and that they would come to see her again another time. "Ah," said the queen, "that forebodes no good. You do not wish to afflict me by an unhappy prediction. I pray you, however, to conceal nothing from me, but tell me all." They tried hard to excuse himself, but this only made the queen more anxious to know her daughter's destiny. At last the chief fairy said to her, "We fear, madam, that Rosetta will bring a severe misfortune upon her brothers, that they will even be put to death on her account. This is all we can foretell of this beautiful little girl, and we are very sorry that we have not better news to give you." They then left her, and the queen remained so sorrowful that the king noticed it. He asked her what was the matter. She replied that she had gone too near the fire, and had burned all the flax off her distaff. "Is that all?" said the king. He went to his stores and bought her more flax than she could have spun in 100 years. The queen was still sad, and the king asked her again what was the matter. She told him that she was walking by the river. He had let one of her green satin slippers fall therein. "Is that all?" said the king. He immediately summoned all the shoemakers in his kingdom, and gave the queen 10,000 slippers made of the same material. Still the queen was not consoled, and the king asked her a third time what was the matter. She said that she was eating too fast. She had swallowed her wedding ring. The king knew that she was not telling him the truth, for he had the ring about him. So he said to her, "My dear, you are telling a falsehood. Here is your ring, which I had in my purse." The lady, as may be supposed, was vexed to be caught telling an untruth, for it is the most wicked thing in the world, and she saw that the king was angry. So she told him what the fairies had predicted of the little Rosetta, adding that if he knew any means of preventing it, he must tell her. The king, much grieved at this, replied, "My dear, I know of no other means of saving our two sons' lives than putting Rosetta to death while she is yet in her cradle." The queen, however, said that she would rather suffer death herself than to consent to so cruel an action, and begged her husband to think of some other remedy. While the king and queen were still thinking on this subject, the queen was told that there was, in a large wood near the town, an old hermit who lived in a lonely cell, and that he was consulted by people far and near. She said, "I must go then and consult him also, as the fairies have told me the evil, but they have forgotten to tell me the remedy." So the next morning she rose early, mounted a pretty little white mule, whose shoes were of gold, and left the palace, accompanied by two of her young ladies, who each rode on a nice horse also. When they were near the wood, the queen and her young ladies alighted, and sought the cell where the hermit lived. He did not like to see the women, but when he perceived that it was the queen, he said to her, "You are welcome. What do you want with me?" She told him what the fairies had said of Rosetta, and asked his advice. He directed her to shut the princess in a tower, and never allow her to leave it. The queen thanked him, rewarded him liberally, and went back to tell the king. The king, having heard this, caused a large tower to be erected, and when it was finished, confined his daughter therein. But that she might not be lonely, he and the queen and the two young princesses visited her every day. The eldest was called Prince Royal, and the youngest Prince Orlando. They both loved their sister passionately, for she was the fairest and the sweetest tempered girl that was ever seen. Her slightest glance was worth more than 100 crowns. When she was 15 years old, the Prince Royal said to the king, "Surely, father, my sister is old enough to be married. Shall we not soon celebrate her wedding?" Prince Orlando put the same question to the queen, but their majesties amused them without replying directly on the subject of marriage. At last the king and queen were taken very ill, and died nearly the same day. Everybody was very sorrowful, and went into mourning. The bells were also tolled throughout the kingdom. Rosetta was inconsolable at the death of her kind mother. When the king and the queen were buried, the noblemen of the kingdom placed the Prince Royal on a golden throne set with diamonds, put a handsome crown on his head, dressed him in violet-colored velvet clothes, spangled with suns and moons, and then all the court cried 3 times, "Long live the king!" Nothing was thought of but rejoicing. The king and the prince said to one another, "Now that we are the masters, we shall surely liberate our sister from the tower, where she has been so long and is so melancholy." To reach the tower they had only to cross the garden, in a corner of which it was built, very high indeed, for the deceased king and queen had intended for her to reside there all her life. Rosetta was embroidering a fine gown on a frame which stood before her, but when she saw her brothers she rose, and taking the king's hand said, "Good morrow, sire. Now that you are king, and I am your little servant, I entreat you to remove me from this tower, where I am very, very solitary." She then began to cry. The king embraced her and told her to dry her tears, for he had come to take her to a fine castle. The prince, who had his pockets full of sweetmeats, gave them to Rosetta and said to her, "Come, let us quit this ugly tower. The king will soon find a husband for you, so do not afflict yourself." When Rosetta saw the nice garden full of flowers, fruits, and fountains, she was so surprised that she could not say a word, for she had, till then, never seen anything of the kind. She looked all round, walked a little way, stopped, and then gathered fruit from the trees and the flowers from the parterre. Her little dog, Fretillon, who was green like a parrot, had only one ear, and who danced to admiration, ran before her, barking, "Bow, wow, wow," with 1,000 leaps and capers. Fretillon very much amused the company, but all at once he ran into a little wood. The princess followed him, and never was anyone more surprised than she was at seeing in this wood a large peacock, which, with its tail spread out, appeared to her so beautiful that she could not take her eyes off of it. The king and the prince, who soon came up with her, asked her at what she was so amazed. She shewed them with the peacock and asked them what it was. They told her that it was a bird of a kind that was sometimes eaten. "What?" said she. "Do they ever kill and eat so beautiful a bird? I declare to you that I will marry no one but the king of the peacocks. I shall then be queen, and I will take care that no peacocks are eaten." It would be impossible to express the king's astonishment. "But, sister," said he to her, "where shall we find the king of the peacocks?" "Wherever you please, sire," said she, "but I will marry no one but him." After she had taken this resolution, the two princesses led her to their castle, where they were obliged to take the peacock also, and put it in her room, for she was very fond of it. All the ladies who had not seen Rosetta hastened to seek an introduction, to pay their court to her. Some brought her sweetmeats, some sugar plums, others rich gowns, fine ribbons, dolls, embroidered shoes, pearls, and diamonds. She was feasted everywhere, and she was so well behaved and civil, kissing her hand and curtsying whenever anything was given her, that everyone was pleased with her. While she was discoursing with her company, the king and the prince were considering how they should find the king of the peacocks, if there were one in the world. They came to the determination of having a portrait taken of the Princess Rosetta, and they had it done so beautifully that it only wanted speech. "Since you will only marry the king of the peacocks, we are about to seek him for you all over the earth. We shall be very glad to find him, and you must take care of our kingdom during our absence." Rosetta thanked them for the pains they were taking, told them that she would govern the kingdom well, and that while they were gone her only pleasures would be looking at the beautiful peacock and seeing Fretillon dance. They could not help crying when they bade one another adieu. Behold the two young princesses on their journey, asking everyone they met, "Pray, do you know the king of the peacocks?" They were always answered, "No, gentlemen, no." They still kept going forward, until at last they got so far that no one had ever seen so far before. They presently arrived at the kingdom of the mayflies. There is no longer such a place to be seen. The mayflies made such a loud humming that the king was afraid he should lose his hearing. He asked the one who appeared to him to be the most intelligent looking among them, whether he knew where the king of peacocks was to be found. "Sire," said the mayfly, "his kingdom is 90,000 miles from here. You have taken the longest road to reach it." "How do you know that?" said the king. "Because," said the mayfly, "we go every year to pass 2 or 3 months in their gardens." Then the king and his brother embraced the mayfly again and again. They became very friendly and dined together. The princes examined with admiration all the curiosities of their country, where the smallest leaf was worth $1. They afterward departed to finish their journey, and, as they now knew the road were not long before they completed it. They observed that all the trees were loaded with peacocks. The place was so full of them that their voices might be heard 6 miles off. The king said to his brother, "If the king of the peacocks is a peacock himself, how will our sister be able to marry him? We should be foolish, too, to consent to the match. What a splendid alliance would she form for us, little peacocks for nephews and nieces!" The prince was equally grieved. "It is an unfortunate fancy that occupies her mind," said he. "I cannot think where she learned that there was a king of the peacocks." When they arrived at the chief town, they observed that it was full of men and women, whose clothes were made of peacock feathers, and that peacock feathers were displayed everywhere as very fine things. They met the king, who was taking an airing in a beautiful little carriage, made of gold and set with diamonds, drawn by 12 peacocks, which were harnessed to it. The king of the peacocks was so very handsome that our king and the prince were charmed with him. He was fair complexioned, had long, light-colored curly hair, and a crown of large peacock feathers. When he came up, he conjectured that the 2 princes, as they were dressed differently from the people of the country, were foreigners, and in order to ascertain, he stopped his carriage and called to them. The king and the prince went up to him, and having made an obeisance, said, "Sire, we have come from afar to show you a portrait." They then took from the portmanteau the large picture of Rosetta. When the king of the peacocks had looked at it, "I cannot imagine," said he, "that there is in the world so beautiful a girl." "The original is 100 times more beautiful than the pictures," said the king. "Ah, you are joking," said the king of the peacocks. "Sire," said the prince, "here is my brother, who is a king like you. He is a king, and I am a prince. Our sister, whose portrait this is the Princess Rosetta, and we are come to ask you whether you are willing to marry her. She is beautiful and very good, and we will give with her a bushel measure full of golden crowns." "Yes, indeed," said the king, "I will marry her with all my heart. She will want nothing with me, and I will be very fond of her. But I assure you that I expect her to be as fair as her portrait, and if she be in the smallest degree less, so I will put you to death." "Well, we consent," answered Rosetta's 2 brothers. "You consent?" said the king. "Go then to prison and remain there until the princess arrives." The princes left him without a murmur, for they were quite certain that Rosetta was more handsome than her portrait. When they were in prison, the king had them well attended to. He went often to see them, and kept in his room Rosetta's portrait, with which he was so infatuated that he slept neither day or night. As the king and his brother were in prison, they wrote to the princess, desiring her to make herself ready and come with all speed to them, for at last the king of the peacocks was found, and was awaiting her arrival. They did not inform her that they were prisoners for fear of making her uneasy. When the princess received the letter, she was so transported with joy as to be quite overcome. She told everyone that the king of the peacocks was found, and wished to marry her. Bonfires were lighted, cannons were discharged, and the sugar plums and sweetmeats were universally eaten, and all who came to see the princess during 3 days were presented with a service of cake and wine. After this liberality, she left her fine dolls to her best friends, and placed the government of her brother's kingdom in the hands of the wisest old men of the capital. She recommended them to take care of all, to spend nothing, and to collect money against the king's return. She begged them to keep her peacock, and took with her only her nurse and her foster sister, with her little green dog, Fritillon. They all embarked in a boat on the sea, taking with them a bushel of golden crowns, and a sufficient quantity of clothes to last them 10 years, changing them twice a day, and did nothing but laugh and sing. The nurse at last asked the boatman, Are we nearing the kingdom of the peacocks?" "Not yet," said he. Once more she asked him, Are we nearing? He said, "Presently, presently." Yet again she asked him, "Are we nearing? Are we nearing?" This time he answered, "Yes." And when he had said so, the nurse came forward and seated herself by him, and said to him, "If you wish it, you shall be rich forever." He answered, "I desire nothing better." She then continued, "If you wish it, then you shall gain lots of dollars." He answered, "I desire nothing better." "Very well," said she. "Tonight, while the princess is asleep, you must assist me to throw her overboard. When she is drowned, I will dress my daughter in her fine clothes, and we will take her to the king of the peacocks, who will be very glad to marry her, and for reward your neck shall be loaded with diamonds." The boatman was very much surprised at what the nurse proposed to him. He told her that it would be a pity to drown so beautiful a princess, and that he was very sorry for her. However, she took a bottle of wine and made him drink so much that he did not know how to refuse her. Night being come, the princess went to bed as usual. Her little Fräulein lay prettily at her feet, without moving a paw. Rosetta was sleeping very soundly, when the wicked nurse, who was watchful enough, left her to fetch the boatman. She brought him where the princess was sleeping, and then, without awakening her, they took her with her feather bed, mattress, sheets, and counterpane, while the foster sister also helped them all she could. They then threw her, bed and all, into the sea, and the princess was sleeping so soundly that she did not awaken. But most fortunately her couch was made of phoenix feathers, which are very scarce and have this property that they cannot sink, which caused her to float in her bed as though she had been in a boat. The water, however, gradually wetted her feather bed, then the mattress, and Rosetta, feeling the water, could not tell what it meant. As she turned, she awakened Fräulein. He had an excellent nose, and smelled the cod and soles so near that he began barking at them, which awakened all the other fish. They began swimming about, and the large fishes ran their heads against the princess's bed, which, being held by nothing, turned around and around like a whip top. Oh, was she not surprised! "Is our boat dancing on the water?" said she. "I am not generally so ill at ease as I have been tonight." As Fräulein still kept barking, for he was in despair, the wicked nurse and the boatman heard it from a distance, and said, "That is the princess's comical little dog, drinking with his mistress to our good health. Let us make haste to arrive," for they were now close to the kingdom of the peacocks. The king had sent to the seashore 100 carriages, drawn by all manners of scarce animals. There were lions, bears, stags, wolves, horses, oxen, asses, eagles, and peacocks, and the carriage intended for the Princess Rosetta was drawn by 6 blue apes, who could leap and dance on the tightrope and play 1,000 pretty tricks. Their harness was very superb, and made of crimson velvet with plates of gold. There were also 60 young ladies whom the king had chosen to wait on her. Their clothes were of various colors, and gold and silver were the least valuable of their ornaments. The nurse had been at great trouble to decorate her daughter. She had dressed her in Rosetta's finest gown, with the diamond headdress and lots of jewels, but in spite of her pains her daughter was as ugly as a monkey. Her hair was black and greasy. She squinted shockingly, her limbs were crooked, she had a large hump between her shoulders, was bad-tempered, slovenly, and always grumbling. When the king of the peacocks people saw her coming out of the boat, they were so surprised that they could not speak. "Heyday, what is the matter?" said she. "Are you all asleep? Make haste and bring me something to eat. You are low wretches, I will have you all hanged." On hearing this, they said among themselves, "What an ugly creature! And she appears to be as wicked as she is ugly. Truly our king will be well married, but I am not surprised when one seeks a wife from the end of the world." She gave as much trouble as she could, and for no offense she struck and boxed the ears of everyone about her. As her equipage was very large, she went along very slowly, and carried her head as high as a queen in her pouch. But all the peacocks who were perched on the trees to salute her as she passed along, and who had resolved to cry, "Long live beautiful Queen Rosetta," when they saw her so ugly, cried, "Fry, fry, how ugly she is!" She flew into a violent passion upon this, and said to her guards, "Kill those rascals of peacocks who are abusing me." The peacocks, however, quickly flew away and laughed at her. The roguish boatman, who saw all that passed, said to the nurse, "Gossip, we are not quite right. Your daughter ought to be prettier." She answered, "Silence, blockhead, you will bring some ill luck on us with your prattle." They told the king that the princess was drawing near. "Very well," said he. "Did her brothers tell the truth? Is she more beautiful than her portrait?" "Sire," said the courier, "it is enough that she is as good looking." "Yes, indeed," said the king, "I shall be satisfied. Let us go and see her." For he guessed by the noise in the courtyard that she was now very near, though he could not make out exactly what was said, except that he thought he heard, "Fry, fry, how ugly she is!" He thought, however, that these cries were applied to some dwarf or beast that she had brought with her, for it never entered his mind that they were speaking of the princess herself. The portrait of Rosetta was carried at the end of a long pole, without any covering, and the king slowly walked after it with all his barons, his peacocks, and the ambassadors from the neighboring kingdoms. The king of the peacocks was very impatient to see his dear Rosetta, but in truth, when he did see her, the sight nearly killed him on the spot. He tore his clothes, put himself into the most violent passion, and would not go near her. She quite frightened him. "What!" said he, "have these two scoundrels that I have in prison had the boldness to make sport of me, and to propose to marry me to such a baboon as that? They shall die. Come away with this silly woman, her nurse, and all who brought them. Let them be confined in the Round Tower." Meanwhile the king and his brother, who were prisoners, and knew that it was about the time for their sister to arrive, had put on their finest clothes to receive her. Instead, however, of seeing their prison door opened and themselves set at liberty, as they expected, the jailer came with soldiers and made them descend into a dark dungeon, full of noxious reptiles, where they were up to their necks in water. No one could be more surprised or sorrowful than they were. "Alas!" said they to each other, "this is a sorrowful wedding for us. What can have been the cause of such a sad misfortune?" They did not know what to think, excepting that they were doomed to death. They passed 3 days in this miserable plight. At the end of that time the king of the peacocks came an opening that was in the wall to reproach them. "You have called yourself king and prince," said he, "to entrap me into a marriage with your sister, but you are wretches who are not worth the water you drink. I am about to give you judges who will soon decide your fate, and the rope is twisting with which I will have you hanged." "King of the peacocks," said our king, filled with indignation, "do not proceed so rashly in this affair, for you may yet repent it. I am, like you, a king, and have a fine kingdom, robes and crowns, and plenty of money. You seem to think very lightly of hanging us. Have we stolen anything?" When the king heard him speak so resolutely, he knew not what to make of it, and had some thought of sparing their lives, and of letting them go with their sister. But his trusty friend, who was a great parasite, encouraged him, saying that if he did not revenge himself, all the world would laugh at him, and think him a weak prince indeed. So he swore that he would not forgive them, and ordered their trial to proceed. It did not last long, as to condemn them it was merely necessary to compare the portrait of the real Princess Rosetta with the person assuming the name. They were therefore sentenced to be beheaded for having told the king a lie, in promising to him in marriage a beautiful princess, and only given him an ugly country girl. This decree was read very formally to them in prison. When they protested that they had not told a lie, for that their sister was a princess, more beautiful than the day, that there was something passing which they could not comprehend, they demanded a respite of 7 days, stating that in that time something might occur by which their innocence could be established. The king of the peacocks, who was very angry, could hardly grant them this favor, but at last he did so. While all this was passing at the court, we must relate what happened to the poor Princess Rosetta. We have stated that when it was daylight she was very surprised, as was Fritillon also, to find herself out at sea, without a boat or any assistance. She cried so pitifully that all the fishes were sorry for her, and she knew not what to do or what would become of her. "Certainly," said she, "the king of the peacocks has ordered me to be thrown into the sea. He has repented his design of marrying me, and to get rid of me decently he would have me drowned. What a silly man!" continued she. "I should have loved him so well, we should have managed so nicely." Then she cried still more, for she could not help loving him. She remained 2 days floating in this manner from one part of the sea to another, drenched to her skin, ready to die with cold, and nearly frozen indeed, had it not been for little Fritillon, who kept up a little warmth near her heart. She would have died 100 times. She was dreadfully hungry. She saw oysters in their shells, and took as many as she liked and ate them. Fritillon was not fond of oysters, however; he was obliged to eat some in order to keep himself alive. When night came on, Rosetta was very much alarmed, and she said to her dog, "Fritillon, pray keep barking, for fear the souls should eat us up." He barked all night long, and toward the morning the princess's bed was not very far from shore. There happened to be thereabout a good old man who lived by himself in a little cottage, into which no one but himself ever entered. He was very poor, but very careless of the things of this world. When he heard Fritillon bark he was quite surprised, for there were no dogs about there. It struck him, therefore, that some travelers had lost their way, and he went out kindly to direct them. Suddenly he perceived the princess and Fritillon, who were floating on the sea, and the princess, seeing him, stretched her arms toward him and cried, "Good old man, save me, or I shall perish here, where I have been 2 days languishing." When he heard her speak so sadly, his heart filled with pity for her misfortunes. He immediately fetched from his house a long boat hook, with which he walked into the water till it was up to his neck, and was once or twice nearly drowned. At last he succeeded in dragging the bed to the land. Rosetta and Fritillon were, as may be supposed, very glad to be once more on dry ground. The princess was very thankful to the good old man, and graciously accepted a blanket, which she wrapped around her. Then barefooted she entered his cottage, where he lighted a little fire of dry straw, and took out of his chest a woman's gown with shoes and stockings, in which Rosetta dressed herself, and clad even thus as a poor peasant girl, she was as beautiful as the day. Fritillon, enraptured, danced around her for her amusement. The old man saw very plainly that Rosetta was some grand lady, for her bedclothes were embroidered with gold and silver, and her mattress was covered with satin. He begged her to tell him her story, promising that he would not reveal a word of it without her permission. She told him all from beginning to end, crying bitterly the while, for she still thought that the king of the peacocks had ordered her to be drowned. "How shall we act, my child?" said the old man to her. "You are a noble princess, used to good living, while I have only black bread and radishes. You will fare but poorly with me, and if you will take my advice, will permit me to go and tell the king of the peacocks that you are here, for were he to see you he would certainly be too happy to marry you." "Ah, he is a wicked man," said Rosetta, "and would put me to death. But if you have a little basket, do but tie it around my dog's neck, and it will be very unfortunate if he did not bring us something to eat." The old man gave the princess a basket, and she tied it Fritillon's neck, and said to him, "Go to the best saucepan in the city and bring back whatever is therein." Fritillon ran to the city, and as the king's kitchen was the best, he went into it, sought out the best saucepan, cleverly took out the contents, and returned to his mistress. "Return to the pantry and fetch me the best thing thence." Fritillon went to the king's pantry, and soon returned with some white bread, muscadine wine, fruits, and sweetmeats. He was so laden that he could not carry more. When it was the king of the peacocks' dinner time, there was nothing in his saucepan or in his pantry. The servants looked at one another, and the king went into a violent passion. "What!" said he, "so I am to have no dinner? Let the spit be put to the fire, and let me have some nice roast beef this evening." The evening being come, the princess said to Fritillon, "Go to the best kitchen in the city, and fetch me a nice piece of roast meat." Fritillon did as he was told, and thinking that the king's was the best kitchen, he very softly entered it while the cooks' backs were turned, and managed slyly to take away all that was on the spit. It looked so delicious that the very sight of it would have given an appetite to a sick man. He returned with his basket full to the princess, who then sent him back again to the pantry, when she brought all the king's stewed fruit and sugar plums. The king, having had no dinner, was very hungry in the evening, and wanted his supper early, but as there was nothing for him, he put himself into a terrible rage, and went to bed supperless. The next day at dinner and supper time it was just the same, so that the king was 3 whole days without eating or drinking anything, because whenever he sat down to eat, his food had all been taken away. His confidant, who was afraid that the king would die, hid himself in a corner of the kitchen, keeping his eyes fixed on the saucepan, which was on the fire boiling. He was soon extremely surprised to see enter the kitchen a little green dog, having only one ear, who went to the pot, took the meat out of it, and put it in his basket. Desirous to know where he went to, he followed him out of the town, right up to the old man's door. He then returned and revealed all to the king, telling him that it was a poor peasant, that his dinner and supper had gone every day. The king was so very much astonished, and ordered the dog to be sent for. The confidant, in order to make his court to the king, was very willing to show the archers the way. They went accordingly, and found the old man and the princess dining on the king's boiled meat. They were taken and bound with large ropes, and Fritilian the same. When they had arrived, and the king was informed of it, he said, "Tomorrow is the last day I granted to those insulting pretenders, and they shall die with the thieves who have stolen my dinner." He then went into his justice hall. The old man threw himself upon his knees, and said that he would tell him the whole truth. While he was speaking, the king looked at the beautiful princess, and was moved at seeing her tears. But when the good old man declared that she was the Princess Rosetta, and had been thrown into the sea by her wicked attendants, in spite of his weakness, for having been so long without food, the king rushed to embrace her, and untying the ropes with which she was bound, told her that he loved her with all his heart. The princes, who were immediately sent for, thought that they were about to be put to death, and came very sorrowfully, hanging down their heads. At the same time the nurse and her daughters were sent for. When they met, they all recognized each other. Rosetta threw herself into her brother's arms. The nurse, her daughter, and the boatman knelt and asked for pardon. The joy was so great that they were forgiven by the king, and the princess and the good old man was handsomely rewarded, always afterward residing in the palace. Finally, the king of the peacocks made every satisfaction to our king and his brother, testifying his grief that they had been so ill treated. The nurse restored to Rosetta her fine clothes and the bushel of golden crowns, and the wedding feast lasted a fortnight. Everybody rejoiced, even little Fritilian, who ate nothing on the occasion but partridge wings. End of chapter 14.